Good evening all, and first of all I would like to welcome you all to this lecture on behalf of tranzit.ro and on behalf of us organizers. This evening we will listen and discuss a lecture given by Dr. VERONICA LAZÃR titled Non-linear Narratives of the Enlightenment. I will say a few words about the theme, and then a few words about Veronica and about the project, and then I will give the virtual floor to VERONICA LAZÃR. And after the presentation, we kindly ask you to ask your questions either directly, or if you're not comfortable or you cannot do this, then please write them in the chat section, and we will read them out loud, and we will kindly ask Veronica to answer them. The last decades marked the re-questioning of Enlightenment, a sort of a return of the problem of Enlightenment. Both the Enlightenment, spelled with a capital E and with the definite article, and Enlightenment, with neither the capital nor the definite article, have entered once again into scholarly and political discussion and discourses. Philosophers, historians, sociologists, and political theorists have endeavored to investigate the social roots of the Enlightenment, stressing its relation to 18th century political and social movements, and contrasted and analyzed its development in various national contexts, while at the same time others have criticized from various philosophical and political perspectives the blindness and the inconsistencies of what they term the project of Enlightenment. We are hence in the position of having gained a greater appreciation of the diversity of opinions and intention within the Enlightenment, while becoming increasingly suspicious of many of the things that we once assumed that Enlightenment represented. Veronica LAZãR's talk will argue first that the legacies of Enlightenment are contextual, contradictory, open-ended and ready to be appropriated in creative ways, and secondly that more than theories, values or attitudes, critical or political, it was above all a few epistemic dislocations brought about by the Enlightenment that proved to be revolutionary for the modern understanding of history, culture, and society, according to the description that Veronica LAZãR gave of her talk, like a sort of introductory remark. When it comes to Veronica LAZãR, to Dr. Veronica LAZãR, she's a researcher in the history of political ideas, contemporary philosophy, philosophy of history, cinema. She has taught for several years at the University of Bucharest and Babes-Bolyai University, and she has written extensively on modern philosophy, modern theories and authors, and other articles on different other themes. And she holds a PhD in philosophy with a thesis titled Theories of History and French Early Enlightenment. This event that we are gathered for here tonight is part of the bigger project Orbiting Modernity from the Steam Engine to Galactic Debris that is developed by tranzit.ro Cluj since 2020 and continuing in 2021. The project's goal being to investigate the relations between the defining elements of modernity, be it science or critical rationality, socio-political and economical dynamics, ideological structures, and their impact on the environment and our planet. The project intends to establish a long-term multidisciplinary collaboration between social and natural sciences, philosophers, artists, and eco-activists. The lecture that we will hear today is part of this broader framework, and we hope for it to bring to the table and to this project a dimension that was very little explored in the themes that we already and the lectures that we already had in this project. Veronica LAZãR, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you Transit, Otilo, Alex, for inviting me in this excellent series of lectures and talks. And I think there have been several which are really impressive by now. Thanks everyone who's here tonight. So I'll speak in English now. I've seen there are a few people who might prefer to hear it in English. My talk tonight will be rather an exercise in clarification. It's also a summary of my recent researches in the Enlightenment, but it's something which is not exactly a sum of theses. It's not a theory, but there are a couple of reflections on that and a couple of polemic reflections on the phenomena. And it's a clarification of my relation with the Enlightenment, my relation as a as a philosopher and as a historian of ideas, which means I'm an empiricist philosopher implicitly. Clarification of my relation with the Enlightenment. But to begin with, when we should take notice that when someone pronounces the word Enlightenment, it's not always easy to understand by default what they mean by it, what they refer to, because there are several fractures of meaning here in the term Enlightenment today. The most important, maybe the most visible, is a cleavage between academic enlightenment on the one hand and popular enlightenment on the other. The popular representations and also the representation in the media, in the political discourses, and so on, are built on big ideas like enlightenment means reason with a capital R. It means secularism, optimism, rights of man, progress, and it's more or less unified. It's a coherent program of modernity making, more or less, one size fits all. While the academic enlightenment, it's quite the opposite, let's say. It's a thoroughly deconstructive movement of all these myths. And it's trying to escape a false unity of the Enlightenment, as historian like Pocock put it. It's a I quote here, it's a construct invented by both left and right in order that they may denounce it. Okay, so it's a political construct implicitly. But actually, there is also a line of fracture in the academic field itself. More exactly, there is a disciplinary divorce between historians' enlightenment and philosophers' enlightenment. The first one, the historians' enlightenment, tended in the last couple of decades towards a sort of nominalism. It challenged continuously every possible definition or stable essence of the Enlightenment. Its main intellectual core, what exactly does it mean? What does it make it an Enlightenment? Its geographical borders. Is it only a Franco-German and Scottish matter, or is it more broad? Do we have Enlightenment in Russia, let's say? Do we have an English Enlightenment also? Because there is a question, there is a strong position that there was no English Enlightenment, only Scottish Enlightenment, because the English were too conservative to have one, actually. Was there one origin and then a transfer of ideas and practices towards other countries, or there were several birthplaces of the Enlightenment? Then again, its actors are continuously challenged. We have new and new actors. We have new dimensions of the phenomena that are considered to be relevant. And the new discovery of new enlightenments continuously. We have Catholic Enlightenment now. We have books on the Catholic Enlightenment, on the Arab Enlightenment, and so on. So it becomes more and more vague or porous. While the philosopher's enlightenment is a little bit more unified. And we deal again here with big ideas, which do not die, which is a good thing, I think, because its focus is usually the Enlightenment's relation with modernity. The nature of modernity, the relation with the French Revolution, with the Haitian Revolution, with what came afterwards, maybe the Napoleonian era, etc. Occasionally, philosophical enlightenment, or enlightenment as it is treated by philosophers, it's accompanied by a representation of what is valuable, what is relevant in philosophy. And usually, paradoxically, it's French philosophers who are considered to be minor, even in France. Rousseau is an exception, but they are seen to be, let's say, not the most important figures in the history of philosophy. At the contrary, we have a serious respect for German and Scottish philosophy. Okay, which means there is also a third divide here, an internal divide, the national one, between different national profiles of the main enlightenments. For example, the French one is often described as being more politically engaged, more hostile towards religious orthodoxy, and defined by the common opposition against some common intellectual or institutional enemies. So all philosophers have a common enemy or two. they might be different, but they have a connection, which is their polemical and political connection. While the Scottish Enlightenment is usually seen as more moderate, more involved with the religious environment, and its main preoccupations revolve around historical, social, economical question of Scotland's underdevelopment and its relation with a much more developed England. And therefore, development in general, what does it mean to develop? And it's the birth of the question of development here in Scotland at this age. And also the historical transition from one age to another, and what does it make? How do they pass from one age to another? What are the main factors? Anyway, overall, in the academic field usually designated as the 18th century studies matured in the last couple of decades in a remarkably self-reflexive direction. It's also very theoretical here and there, because it's also very preoccupied with methodologies. I don't know any other field in intellectual history who is as preoccupied by theory and methodology. It continuously interrogates the capacity of ideas to shape reality and the indebtedness of ideas to political, economical, social contexts, etc., and also methods that historians should embrace. And the main developments now are linked with interrogation of these age-old meta-narratives, which were one ingrained in the understanding of the Enlightenment and its impact on Western modernity. The relation between reason and the irrationality or superstition or religion, the anti-historical spirit of the Enlightenment as a philosophy of the bourgeoisie, and so on. So today, intellectual history of the Enlightenment is a continuous and systematic busting of these mythologies and teleological assumptions. Nevertheless, there is one accepted narrative that has been rather reinforced by the otherwise very welcome developments in post-colonial and subaltern studies and questions regarding gender and racial relations. The narrative of the Enlightenment genealogy of modern scientific racism, or rather the necessary rootedness of the latter in the ethnography and anthropology of the Enlightenment, which was decisively shaped by economic and interest in colonial rivalries. But this narrative is not very cold. Post-colonial criticism of the Enlightenment were somehow anticipated in the West by an interest in the New World, by the question of the so-called savage, and the problematic relation between Europe and the other, which, according to a historian like Silvia Sebastiani, emerged significantly in the post-colonial context of the 1950s, especially with the publication in 1952 under the aegis of UNESCO of Claude Lévi-Strauss' Race et Histoire, and then 3 years later of his other great, his very important book, Tristropique. In the same year, 55, another very important book was published, which was Antonello Gerbi's The Dispute of the New World, which investigated the process of self-recognition of European consciousness in the face of otherness, the other. They had very different approaches, methodological and different perspectives, but they did address the same problem of the continuity between the discovery of the New World and the emergence of the Third World. And then in the 1970s, the debate started to focus on theories, on the relation between race and the Enlightenment, and this really changed the general perspective. Of course, by then, other criticism of the Enlightenment had time to become canonical, but they were usually conservative or anti-revolutionary, anti-modern, imbued with romantic sensibility, and even worse. So in the 70s, in the English-speaking world especially, this new type of criticism emerged. And there was this pioneering work, which was polemically designed to unmask the supposed innocence of the Enlightenment, actually the hypocrisy of the Enlightenment. It was written by Richard Popkin, who denounced the centrality of racism in the universalistic conception of men. And then there was another author, George Moss, who declared in his Towards the Final Solution that Enlightenment had been the main source of modern biological racism. Also, Marxist authors had a contribution to this, people like Giuliano Viotti, for instance. And if traditionally Enlightenment tended to be associated with liberal arguments for the abolition of slavery, colonial studies did the opposite, and it uncovered the colonial context of the Enlightenment. And it was a very, very important, very productive criticism of it. Some authors even concluded that its central ideas were not the social contract, but the racial contract, not with the people, but with the white people. Nevertheless, there are still several problems with these post-colonial or decolonial writings. One of the most significant for us here today is that they tend to constitute Enlightenment as well as a unified construct. This in turn enables us to see the West as well as something unified, as something animated by a common purpose, by a shared project. And there are authors who said that this kind of reification of the West, it's not very dissimilar to what Said called Orientalism. It's the reverse of the Orientalism. There are people who, like Neil Lazarus, who recently gone so far as to argue that the concept of the, I quote, the concept of the West as it is used in post-colonial theory has no coherent or credible reference. It is an ideological category masquerading as a geographical one. So it's abstracted from its origin, its geography, its states, the states that compose these empires, and also its texts. So it's a very elusive Enlightenment, the post-colonial Enlightenment. I think this is a little bit unjust, and I don't think that post-colonial studies invented a non-existent entity called the West. But they did transcribe what the Marxist has decried as imperialist exploitation into the realm of, they did transcribe into the realm of cultural theory of what the Marxists had decried as imperialist exploitation. And this cultural theory is based on all kinds of abstractions, indeed. Rationalism, universalism, hypocrisy of theories of equality, human rights science, etc. And it's what I think is very interesting, and it's sometimes it's not very linked to actual texts, so it's not based on reading on text. And when they are references to texts, they are usually German Enlightenment texts. And this is interesting because first, it was not the German Empire who actually built European imperialism in the 18th century, or the networks of colonial transportation and exploitation. And then it's interesting because it's itself indebted to German reading of German Enlightenment, and also to a German conservative spirit that regarded the Enlightenment as being something very pernicious to modernity in a way. And there are many common elements in the conservative criticism of the Enlightenment and in the post-colonial one, although the stakes are obviously very, very dissimilar. But anyway, I think that sometimes it's by reading 19th century political views on progress and nationality, empire, back into the Enlightenment that we actually tend to have this kind of image of the Enlightenment. Okay. While I do believe that these relations between, on the one hand, Enlightenment anthropology and French and British imperialism, and on the other, Enlightenment anthropology again, and 19th century scientific racism are indisputable, my take is to question the inevitability of this intellectual genealogy. It's not my intention here to play down the racism, misogyny scattered across texts, theories, gestures, etc. These are not only residual, but sometimes they are new products of these texts. Okay, they are innovations. And I think that those who do that, who think that they are residual or marginal or not relevant to the great texts and great theories, are mistaken, both at the historical level and political level. They do belong, many of them do belong to a philosophical, to theoretical core, and they are important, but not in a very simple way. It's something that traditional Marxists still do. They tend to ignore or to not to see how important these elements, these dimensions are. So I will argue not that the Enlightenment did not supply racist categories of thought, which is undeniable, but that the social, historical, ethnographical, and anthropological thinking of the mostly French and Scottish Enlightenment was for almost half a century a great and enormously varied field of empirical and speculative inquiry. And it was open-ending, epistemically, and also politically. And as a principle, I think we should pay attention to the plasticity of ideas, which is of course not unlimited. We cannot do everything with ideas, but it's nevertheless surprising in a way. And I think that everyone who ever reflected on and was puzzled by the way sometimes left-wing ideas are reappropriated by conservative right-wing lobbies and groups and ideologies. See, for instance, the brilliant essay by Corey Robin, The Reactionary Mind, who explains how this works sometimes. So anyone who thought about it might be a little bit sensitive to this plasticity of ideas. This seems as a general principle. But also, and mostly now, I think we should pay attention to the plasticity and profound ambivalence of Enlightenment ideas in particular. They do have a context-bound significance, and their context is not our context anymore. But they also have an intrinsic ambivalence, and my talk will be about it. And I think that before the non-ambiguous metamorphosis into scientific racism later into the 19th century, forms of reflection emerged that could have unfolded in totally different directions, as their epistemic and political destiny was not predetermined. Okay. For a start, politically progressive arguments and progressive views on the other did not necessarily align. You could have one without having the other, and vice versa. So speaking about radical thinkers, as Jonathan Israel does, for instance, is very confusing. Someone like Voltaire could be a harsh critic of religious dogmatism and of the church, and in the same time a supporter of monarchic absolutism. Or someone like Rousseau could be, even according to our standards, an enormously progressive figure in terms of political and economic thinking. He could be a radical pioneer of anthropological self-reflection, for instance. He acknowledged, like no other of his contemporaries did, that ethnographic observation and descriptions always come with biases, cultural and political, and that is of the observer, of course, and it is vital, although almost impossible, to be aware of your own categories of observation and thinking. And he still was a horrid conservative preacher of women's submission, of their withdrawal from public life, and their necessary commitment to their domestic and maternal duties. It was their nature. Often philosophers tackle information about other nations like China, India, Persia, Ottoman Empire as test cases for their own theories. These theories are their main focus, while the former, speaking about other nations, are of marginal interest, which means that specific criticism aiming at, let's say, the French political regime, their institutions, or even colonial practices like slavery, could be sometimes very audacious and in the same time be coupled with reductionist, phantasmatic representation of non-European peoples. The Baron of La Hontan, one of the first authors to describe at the beginning of the century the so-called savage humanity as being superior to the European one, came from an old declining savage aristocratic family, which was not very satisfied with the monarchic centralization of the French state and the decrease of the liberties as aristocratic understood liberties. And he made, in one of his texts, the Huron Adario voice pretty interesting arguments against political despotism. But as historian Sankar Mutu notices in his book about the Enlightenment resistance against empire, I quote, "The presentation of New World peoples that served as anthropological basis of unorthodox or even radical moral and political claims ultimately came at the price of presenting them as largely hardwired automatons, rather than as creative agents who were embedded within and who shaped and altered cultural systems of meaning and value." End quote. And in this movement from the middle of the 18th century onwards, through a very consistent effort to create an estrangement effect, an effect of depth when dealing with the historical past, to historicize the past, so to say, French and Scottish authors start to compare historical distance with geographical distance. The past is another country, or as Buffon has said, the past is like distance, or in Turgot's words, history is like a geography in succession. Frequently now, the relation between European and non-European cultures are now translated as a difference between stages of historical development according to a trajectory which is common to all mankind. So everyone can be inscribed in this trajectory potentially. And Lafitaux's observation that the American natives and the ancestors of Western Europeans were actually quite similar in their customs and the way in their beliefs, in their religious institutions and so on. Or Locke's observation in the second treatise that in the beginning of the world, all the world was America, become a system of thought, a kind of macro narrative of development or evolution. It's a common path that every human community could potentially follow. Will, it depends. Which of course means in principle that non-Europeans, the so-called savage nations, were not described anymore as being simply natural men standing outside history somewhere. This is good. On the other hand, their historicization itself tended simply to mean that they were inserted in this macro narrative of the general human evolution, not that they received and that they enjoyed an internal historicity of their own, a diverse internal diversity of customs, etc. So they are just pieces on the map. They actually received a place in the map, but they were abstract. So they represent a most consistent contribution to the historicization of the West itself, because ethnographic literature and the comparative anthropology and the way they were read by philosophers, etc., fueled vital research that practically revealed to the West its own historicity and the historicity of its institutions, law, forms of property, discovery that property was not something eternal, natural, something just universal, or gender relations. So these nations contributed to this, but in the same time, that tended to be depicted in an increasingly abstract and depoliticized and flattened way. In brief, and sometimes there were even thick descriptions of these peoples. So real ethnographic interest in these peoples, who travelers who had actually gone there, or missionaries had gone there and wrote beautiful works of ethnographic description, and also contributed to this general narrative. In brief, there is, I think, no direct corollary between political radicalism and the Enlightenment authors, accuracy of Enlightenment. So there is no connection, no direct connection between political radicalism and the accuracy of ethnographic description. Okay, they are two different things, and sometimes they might be opposite. And moreover, if the anthropology of race itself and the question of slavery are of course connected and they develop together now, they are not superposed, they do not have the same origin, they are not perfectly contemporary, and they cannot be reduced one to the other. And as historian Justin E. Smith notices, I quote again from Justin E. Smith, often questions of race come up in the early modern philosophy text, not so much because the author is interested in race for its own sake, but simply because an example or anecdote involving it helps the author to illustrate a point about some other philosophical problem. So they are of marginal interest. I ended the quote. And this will be the case for polygenetic explanations of human diversity. Moreover, there was a problem of there is a problem of philosophical anthropology that would have been there had there been no so-called discovery of America, New World encounter with Native Americans and so on, or transatlantic slave trade, had slavery not taken yet a rigidly racial dimension for Europeans, but was traditionally associated in their minds with the Ottoman slave trade or the economic slavery system of the Romans, ancient Romans. And in my opinion, this curiosity about human diversity grew long before biological racism. It grew enormously during the Renaissance. It grew with the taxonomies of natural science and the secularization and the definition of what exactly does it mean to be a human. And also they became integrated into great narrative when globalization and transatlantic slave trade came in. Anyway, this is why I think it's very interesting to look at these earlier developments. We'll not do this here tonight, but it's interesting to see what happened in the 16th and 17th century to understand the difference, the specificity of the 18th century developments. What happened when the slave trade became a mass phenomena, and what was its impact on the racial theory itself. There were very few Enlightenment philosophers that supported or were sympathetic to slavery. And the more we advance towards the end of the century, the fewer they become. Some, like Condorcet, would found abolitionist movements where intellectual activity fused with overt militantism. Some abolitionists were very religious, by the way. There are nevertheless many gray areas, even dark gray, with again a conservative Voltaire whose very pessimistic and fatalist account on human nature allowed for an accommodation with the current practices of inequality and exploitation. And if human nature has a penchant towards brutality and superstition, especially in the margins of civilization, of course, if African mothers voluntarily sell their children into slavery, if African leaders sell their subject to the Western slavers, Who are we, asks Voltaire in one of his texts, to condemn the Westerners who buy them and who put them to work? In his case, we can test Marshall Sally's insight that sometimes strong anthropological pessimism is indeed the corollary of a political conservatism. But there is nothing really ambiguous in Voltaire yet. There are others who are actually ambiguous. What's surprising, it's the case of an argument against universalism and for cultural particularism like Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a harsh critic of slavery. In the spirit of the laws, he deployed a multi-layered criticism of it. He also wrote against the unification of the French state and its legal institutions and so on, by saying that the regions were culturally very different, they had different origins, and they cannot be under the same legal umbrella, for instance. And these kind of arguments of specificities, cultural specificities on the national level or at the global level, could be and was sometimes reappropriated in behalf of maintaining a slavery system. For instance, in the writings of Pierre-Victor Malouet, a French colonial administrator, not himself a philosopher, but close to these environments of philosophers, who believed that thanks to their particular nature, unaccustomed with the tropical climates, with the exhaustion of labor in the sugarcane fields and the whips in the back, work on the plantation would necessarily kill any white man or any white woman who bravely attempted to do such a thing. And I have again a long quote here by David Allen Harvey, who observes somewhere that Creole lawyers and publicists, relying on Montesquieu's notion of customary law, popularized an ideology of local knowledge to criticize what they regarded as a high-handed application of metropolitan legal standards and practices to a Caribbean society based on radically different institutions. Through this selective reading of Montesquieu, the defenders of slavery developed a Creole parlementaire tradition based upon a véritable deification of what the colonists typically called local knowledge. By emphasizing environmental determinism and the primacy of local traditions, the planters and their representatives sought to condone off the colonies from the metropole as separate societies requiring separate laws between which the twain could never meet. Okay, I end the quote. I think what's relevant here as well is that we should take into account that when we speak about something like the French or British colonial empires, something that sometimes post-colonial criticism tends to forget, is that in each case, there was a deep structuring rift between at least two political forces, two agents, the metropolitan administration and the colonial elites. While the former sought to strengthen, to consolidate the centralized rule, the military apparatus, because also they needed to wage colonial wars against the other states, to impose taxes, to curb the tendency of the planters to increase exploitation, etc. The planters, on the contrary, the patriots, who were called themselves patriots sometimes, sought to be as autonomous as possible and to escape these forms of control from the metropolitan administration, to assert their independency, etc. And they also drew a lot on this kind of racist, localist arguments of the specificity of Black labor force. Anyway, this contributed enormously to the general intellectual interest in the question of slavery, in the question of race, in good ways and in bad ways as well. Because between these political rifts, theories and polemical arguments flourished, of course. And the more we take distance from the heart of colonial politics and its direct actors, the more abolitionist arguments start to flourish as well, because of course, nor the state, nor the imperial state, nor the colonists were interested yet in abolishing slavery. And the stake of the arguments become more and more independent from direct and economic colonial interests. Although, of course, there is also this context which is still there. And these theories that flourish in this period, Talal Asad writes somewhere that anthropologists themselves and philosophers did not have an important role in all this, that they were very marginal in comparison to the vast body of information that had been accumulated by merchants, missionaries, administrators. They were really not important for the colonial power, which doesn't mean that the reverse proposition is true. They actually, the anthropological knowledge benefited from this accumulation of knowledge coming from everywhere. And it is their ambiguity of these theories that made them very slippery. They could be both and simultaneously emancipatory instruments for criticizing imperial power relations and theories, and resources for their consolidation. And I think, in my opinion, from these philosophical or anthropologist theories, one can depart in opposite directions, and one can get to rationalizing, dehumanizing theoretical positions starting from everywhere. And this is one of my main arguments here. And during these decades of hesitation, of explorations in theories and in empirical discoveries, it was before the formation of biological racism proper, before the great conservative epistemological turn of the 19th century. And I think there was a great potential for developments that might have gone differently. And let's take some examples of these famous ambiguities. Polygenism, for instance. The theory that men around the world do not have the same common origin. Usually the great-great-parents, Adam and Eve, but they have several origins, and which might be very remote geographically. It was born during the Renaissance in a milieu of libertines and free thinkers. And it was an attempt to offer an alternative, a naturalist explanation of the origins of the humans that could overcome the biblical narratives. So it was a naturalist one. The function of this frame, the Polygenist frame, changed dramatically in the 18th century. As Richard Popkin observes somewhere in his book about it, in the early modern period, attributing separate origins to separate human groups often had more to do with questioning the authority of scripture. And we might add with exploring proto-evolutionary ideas that ultimately stem from Arabic Aristotelian account of spontaneous generation, then with excluding certain human groups from a full share of humanity. So in the 18th century, Polygenism destiny, unintended destiny, would be to become an ally of essentialist hierarchies between humans, between human groups. Diderot, a materialist who flirted with Polygenists, was nevertheless reluctant because he understood that Polygenism might become an obstacle against abolitionist arguments. During the Renaissance, with Giordano Bruno or Vanini or La Peyrère, Polygenism had no intention to organize peoples by fixing their places in a universal and hierarchical scheme. But with modern Polygenists like Voltaire and Hume, humanity became a two-speed humanity, let's say. For some, there was culture, politics, society, and for the other, on the other side of the map, brutish nature. And Polygenism would soon become a very common assumption in many racial, so-called scientific theories that essentialized races and hierarchies between them in Georges Cuvier, Ernst Haeckel, or the English naturalist that has the meritorious name of Charles White. So this explicitly anti-Christian abandonment of religious universalism had now potentially very dangerous consequences, which doesn't make monogenism a risk-free theory. In the middle of the 18th century, many theologians, clerks, and missionaries, and especially Jesuit priests, hold strong to the old traditional universalist monogenist theory, maintaining that all men are human, brothers, and equal in sometimes very complicated ways, okay? And they search for alternative circumstantial explanations of the varieties between men and nations. But this universalism of theologians or of natural scientists can still allow a deeply hierarchical depiction of nations and peoples. With diffusionism, with its countless versions, some mythologicals, the son of Noah that populated the earth, or the people that had lived in the legendary city of Atlantis. Some are more rigorous and scientific, like Buffon. And they explain the geographical remoteness of the fact that there were people so far away from Europe was thought to be the origin of the world. Of course, Europe and Middle East. And they had to explain why people had gone so far. And they explain it by diffusionism, migration. And the differences between people were explained by circumstantial, natural, and cultural reasons. But this, the corollary of diffusionism could be a very neutral, politically neutral theory, or it could be a very toxic theory. It could take a nuance of degeneration. And we had plenty of theories of degeneration. In the 18th century, diversity did not mean equality by default. Christian religion could degenerate into paganism and idolatry and superstition. The original language, which was of course Hebrew, could degenerate into confusion, confusion of dialects after the fall of the Tower of Babel. And of course, white race could degenerate into all the others, something else. It's always the blacks who degenerate from the whites, never the other way around. In the same time, the need to explain these differences stemmed from diffusion, from migration, stimulates an attention to local circumstances, so an empirical attention to these facts. And this interest in the relativity of customs, which is of course not new because we can find it in the Renaissance skeptics, for instance, but also in the writings of Herodot, becomes ambiguous in the Enlightenment. We can say indeed with David Allen Harvey that the Enlightenment people were quite obsessed with diversity. They did not ignore it, they did not suppress it, but they were obsessed with it. I think also this is true. They were usually voracious readers of ethnographic literature, and they increasingly embraced the belief that society, culture, and institutions shape individual and collective identities. And I think this is, in my opinion, one of the most important innovations of the Enlightenment thought. The fact that they acknowledge this capacity of society and culture to shape identities. And of course, it led to a greater capacity to perceive and to acknowledge cultural and historical difference, to denaturalize Western political arrangements, your institution, political institutions, and so on, and to change political ontology of Western societies. It was a long shot, though. Nevertheless, in the Enlightenment, the ensuing cultural relativism of all these developments is rarely, maybe never, followed by a refrain from formulating normative attitudes. To recognize, like the historian John Miller did, one of the first great historians of the family, made a natural history of the family. It's a great reading. To recognize that modern monogamous marriage is just a particular institution among others, because they were in different societies, we had polygamy, matriarchy, and each of them was a particular product of particular social, legal, and economic arrangements, because kinship, he said, was mirroring, in each case, the structures of property, and structures of property mirror the resources available in each society and its strategies for economic subsistence. So we have a proto-historical materialism, or there we can see it like that. But it didn't mean, it did not lead him to the conclusion that modern monogamous families should be in any way subverted, questioned, revolutionized, reformed, left open. He does not need to naturalize domestic relations in order to preserve them as they are. They can be constructed, or they can be historical, and they still have to stay there. So I said that seeing the shaping power of property relation, of culture, of social norms, of customs and habits, recognizing their universal scale of action was a revolution in social thought. It was usually the case with the Scottish historians, with Adam Smith, with Ferguson, with Hume, with John Miller, etc. And they were committed to explore the effects. They usually call them moral causes. Moral meant something different from what it means today. Which didn't mean that the conclusions were politically progressive always. And we also have an ambiguity here. For instance, Adam Smith notes somewhere, I think in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, if I remember correctly, that the difference between a manual worker and a philosopher is a difference in social habitus, the decades-long routine that form each of them, their talents, abilities, and of course, intellectual and bodily limitations. And this inherent plasticity of the social individual could, in principle, make someone advocate the extensions of the rights to education to people who belong to popular environments, for instance. And there were people who did that, who said, okay, we should open the educational system to people who have not been educated. Or it could lead in the opposite direction, like in Hume, for instance, to convert it to a new social fatality, and as an ingrained identity of the person that condemns men or women to what they actually became. Okay, and we have this wonderful passage in his essay, National Characters, where he says, poverty and hard labor debase the minds of the common people and render them unfit for any science and ingenious profession. End of the quote. Once a manual worker, you will always be a manual worker. Even if you became a manual worker, you were not born, you were not made by God. How much time do I have?
10, 15 minutes.
Okay.
15.
You will never invite me again to speak here. There is this wonderful historian I like very much, Lorraine Daston. And one of her theories is that early moderns embraced a new conception of nature, which was totally different from the ancient old conceptions of nature, because they understood it for the first time as being universal, uniform, everywhere the same, determining, while the ancients' conceptions of nature were that nature was plural, adapted to local conditions, to specific regions, to species of animals and plants. So nature was not one, there were several. And these plural natures have each of them, or could have, moral authority. Moreover, nature and custom or culture were not understood as being in opposition. Rather, they were both plastic, and they worked together in a kind of integrative model, a kind of composite. In the 18th century, Montesquieu still worked within this integrative frame. He did not separate between nature and culture. And in the spirit of the laws, we can see at work a complex model that brings together nature and culture. Nevertheless, the two elements of this aggregate were not standing on the same level. For some nations, natural environments, weighted much more than for others, and made them practically unable to behave like free people. His environmentalist anthropology was hierarchical, but so was the anthropology of his most brilliant opponent, David Hume, who rejected the correlation between climate zones and national characters, but he nevertheless stated in this infamous note of this infamous text, National Characters, that I think everyone knows by now. I quote from Hume. So Montesquieu offered climateric and environmentalist explanation. Hume opposed to that, but he nevertheless said, "I am apt to suspect that the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures among them, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, and whom none ever discover any symptoms of ingenuity. It means we couldn't find any intelligence in the Negroes. Though low people without education will start up among us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it is likely he is admired for slender accomplishment, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly." I end the quote. So Hume is basically here contrasting a class distinction with a racial distinction as well. So cultural particularism can then support a very beneficial self-relativization, the questioning of one's own cultural practices. See, for instance, Diderot, who wrote about Tahitians, but also back racist arguments, theories about local knowledge and local rights helping colonies to justify their exploitative practices. The climate theory can either be used to justify the unity of the mankind, all men are the same, and they would be similarly acted upon by the same circumstances, or on the contrary, to prove the superiority of the whites living in temperate climates. In itself, and according to our criteria today, cultural and social explanations could indeed be potentially progressive. Nevertheless, they could also be incoherently applied with dramatic consequences. Hume is again an example of this, and we can go back to that quote. Should I give you the quote on the chat? I don't know if I read it clear in a way that you could understand. So Hume's critique of physical causes and climate theories marked a very important step towards the historicization of national differences. And he was very useful in shaping all these proto-sociological instruments. At the same time, he was fundamentally prone to a double standard. On the one hand, he described principles governing human nature as being universal and uniform. what produced the variety of national characters is the variety of circumstances, historical facts and all kinds of facts. In this, he was no different from his contemporaries, Adam Smith, Lord Keynes, John Miller, Adam Ferguson. But while he developed complex explanations of the peculiarities of European institutions, and he engaged with all this sophisticated proto-sociological Scottish school, he also denied, on the other hand, the intellectual abilities of the Black and their capacity to self-improvement. The Africans were tied to their race in a way that the whites were not. So his method was blatantly incoherent. You can have history, society, and culture as explanatory forces on the right side of the map, and nature on the other. Likewise, Rousseau, after a splendid description in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequalities of the transformation of pre-social man into a social being, a process which required an acquisition of specific features and faculties which are not natural to men: language, reason, abstract thought, emotions, propensity to have a family, to love, etc. After concluding that every man, and especially the species, the human species, is a result of a contingent and open process, Rousseau proceeds in another writing, in the Emile, to naturalize the role of women and to announce that her role is to give birth to children. Therefore, her education had to be very well adjusted to this very peculiar role, to her future confinement in the domestic realm. Similarly, perverse and opposed consequences could have those models that strongly differentiated men as such, men as men, from animals, declaring men to be superior to any non-human form of life, like for instance in Christian theology. So the important thing was to be men. Didn't matter exactly what kind of. But some of these people who wrote in this frame could recreate internal hierarchies of the human, internal scales, a great chain of being, but inside the humanity, and descend and make some human groups descend until they basically hit the bottom of the scale in the close vicinity with animals. It was usually the case with Hottentots and pygmies, were the eternal candidates to this gentle treatment. And this vicinity with animals was even more debasing, since the most important thing was to be non-animal. Buffon, who was the great French naturalist Buffon, who was a monogynist, a main character in the making of the degeneration narrative, he thought everything American was degenerate, humans, plants, animals, etc. But he was nevertheless reluctant to embrace all the consequences of his theory, a full essentialist differentiation between races of men. He criticized the theory that there exist several races. He thought they did not exist. And the supreme proof was that couples from different racial groups could have fertile offspring. They could have children who could have children themselves. So he strongly opposed both Linnaeus' essentialist theory of races and all other kinds of extrapolations from his own theory. He was self-reflexive. He made experiments in thought and in theories, but he opposed the ultimate consequences of these theories. And he also opposed the transposition of naturalists' arguments into politics and theories of society. Vice versa. Enlightenment theories that we might call today anti-speciest, that suppressed the line separating men from animals, could either state that some groups of men were unable to use their reason, and reason was a fundamental human faculty, and they were not exactly human, again, Africans. Or this anti-specism could be ingrained in a theory that was not meant to dehumanize certain nations, but to suggest, as Rousseau did in his brilliant discourse on the origin of inequality, that the human species has constituted itself through a long, open-ending contingent process while initially men were indistinguished from animals, were kind of animals, and that was perfectly fine for Rousseau and for these men. It was not something that he decried, at the contrary. So reason as a criteria for humanity can be a principle of inclusion, even gradually, as in Leibniz, or of exclusion, like in Linnaeus. And I think I'll have a last example. Cartesian dualism, okay, as it was incorporated in the philosophical anthropology. Cartesian dualism has been considered for some time responsible for many Enlightenment evils. In Jonathan Israel, for instance, who thinks that anything which is not monist is not materialist, and everything which is not materialist is not politically radical. Or in a beautiful text by Walter Mignolo, the colonial writer, was a text that was translated by Ovidiu Țichineleanu 12 years ago in Idea magazine. In the colonial literature, Cartesian dualism of body and mind yields a system of hierarchic opposition that suits splendidly to European imperialism and colonial domination over other nations. We have a system of oppositions, okay? Soul versus body, reason versus sensibility, freedom versus necessity, masculine versus feminine. Okay, nevertheless, I think we can infer, and there are also historians who infer and who pretend that Cartesian dualism in anthropological thought had an enormous emancipatory potential, because in a Cartesian ontology of the human, the individual could leave the cultural, biological particularities of his being and descend to universality of the mind, which rendered racism inconsistent. So regardless of the color of her skin, someone could indeed be a philosopher, which is of course the top of the creation. Maybe I should get to the conclusion. So what are my points here? Many points. Firstly, that there was no politically safe ontology of the human. You cannot say this was good and this was bad. This could not have. This was sure. It's a sure terrain for theory. Of course, there are many things besides theory that made the theory what it was: the context, the macro context, the micro context, etc. And I think that instead of investing these theories with a full coherence and completedness, which they did not possess actually, it's more useful to see them in their tensions and contradictions that would be solved decades later, in the early 19th century especially, in more coherent and more unapologetic forms of racism, Eurocentrism, but which could have been solved otherwise in totally different directions, with the European imperialism and making of scientific discipline have developed in other ways. Two, that the Enlightenment intellectuals did not draw from their theories and arguments the conclusions that we today might draw. Three, that Enlightenment was racist and all. And however, besides countless criticism of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, political authoritarianism, besides a high degree of political and epistemic reflexiveness, Enlightenment also generated an instrument that I think we should cherish. Instrument and categories of thought. It discovered history and historicity, discovered society and the idea that social and historical construction and individual and communities. It discovered culture in the modern anthropological sense. It discovered the historicity of nature. Or I think we could safely abandon everything which might superficially call the legacy of the Enlightenment. Most of it is a fiction. It's very remote. it's anachronistic, it's a projection of something which is much more recent. It was made and remade for 2.5 centuries. I'm not sure about that yet, but I'm thinking maybe you should rather embrace a kind of presentism to get to know this history very well, not to mistake it for something else, to get to know what Enlightenment meant and brought, but to leave it aside. And I would finish again with a few lines from an older text by Lorraine Destin. That will be the end. I quote, "It is one of the oddest oddities of current intellectual life that nature, once the battering ram of social criticism, think of Condorcet, and history, once the bulwark of tradition, think of Edmund Burke, have exchanged political valences. History now purportedly subverts the status quo with counterexamples. Nature purportedly shores it up with stubborn facts. We need a politics which can argue honestly about politics, without nature, without history." Thank you.
Veronica Lazăr, thank you so much for your presentation, for this tour de force through the intricacies and the subtleties of Enlightenment and 18th century and modern thought. I think it has been a most engaging lecture for all the participants. I kindly ask the participants, the public, if you have questions, please prepare them, or if you please raise your hands, and then I'll give you the floor, or if not, put them in the chat. And I would also like to apologize if once in a while I muted persons during the presentation. It was just because it was interfering with the presentation. So I apologize for that move, but it was motivated by this. Okay, as I think everybody needs a moment to maybe formulate some questions. Thank you again for this lecture. I think I don't know. I feel like I don't know everything you wanted to know about Enlightenment, and you can ask right now. And I don't know. I have some general questions, as I'm not a specialist on this. And the first one, maybe it's not related, and if it's not related, then you can close it quite rapidly, such as not to divert the discussion. But you started from the question of methodology, and regarding this, my curiosity is regarding your own approach to or your own perspective on the approach to the history of ideas, and how we study the history of ideas and the debates that ignited, around this topic. I'm thinking about, I don't know, the contextualism of Skinner, the variants of political Marxism, and reading regarding that, conceptual history, and so forth. And I would like to know where do you situate yourself in this, regarding this possible methodological options. And the second question, which is related to that, and this is only a curiosity, as I have no idea if things are like this or not, if these debates regarding the, I don't know, the problems that arise when studying the histories of ideas had an impact on the shattering of this unity of the legacy of Enlightenment, methodologically speaking, or theoretically. If the reopening of the question of the Enlightenment can be also connected to these debates regarding the, I don't know, the questioning of the history of ideas and how we look at them. Here, I think we already have a, oh, okay. And then we also have a question, so I'm not going to go further. I think for the sake of organizing a bit, just we'll take one question and then one answer, and like this we go, if everybody agrees with this. We also have a question now from Cornel Ban. What strand of the Enlightenment is most useful to think critically about the climate crisis?
So I should ask very briefly to your first question, Dana. I'm not sure where I stand on this methodological map. I think I'm a kind of scavenger of ideas and methods. So I'm, I don't know.
It was just a curiosity.
I'm interested in history of science, interested in the history of historical categories, scientific categories, but what exactly do I write? That's a very good question. I don't know if I can. I think it's intellectual history in a very broad sense, where I integrate all kind of social history and intellectual history. And the second about how can we use? Can you please?
Yeah, it's mostly a curiosity. For example, once the idea that there are perennial themes of philosophy, out there, or concepts mean or are relevant in the same way that they were the time they were uttered. Like I was thinking broadly about Skinner's critique to this type of approaches emerge. And I was just asking if this type of debates maybe had an impact of this like gradual shattering of this unity of the legacy of Enlightenment that it's been going on for the past decades. It was just a curiosity if they are connected in a way or another.
Yeah, I think they are very connected. I think there is this great, let's call it revisionist trend in history of intellectual thought. We don't even call it history of ideas, because history of ideas has a very strong idealist meaning dimension. So they don't refer to ideas as as separate entities from the rest. But also they are linked because myth busting is everywhere. Okay, so maybe it started with a post-war myth busting of the French Revolution, what it meant, how it was not exactly a bourgeois revolution, how it's not exactly the outcome of the Enlightenment. And of course, it touched upon the Enlightenment. Once the Enlightenment was being perceived as decoupled from the revolution, it started to have an identity of its own in an anti-teleological depiction of it. And it started to have an identity of its own, and then it lost this identity, as I think I explained at the beginning of the talk, because they're all kind of historical criticism of every kind of theory. So every theory is deconstructed in 100 of ways. Every theory about its shape, identity, essence, etc. But I think it all started with the French Revolution, and it's Marxist narrative and also liberal narrative, because we know very well that they are the same great narrative about the French Revolution. So we have no more bourgeoisie in the French 18th century. So what do we do with the Enlightenment? We have no bourgeoisie. Who made the Enlightenment? Why? Etc. So yeah, there is this link, a strong link. I think Skinner was very influenced by this. And of course, it was a strong movement against economicist explanations of the Enlightenment and Revolution. So the criticism of the social explanations of the Revolution and Enlightenment. So they didn't talk anymore about classes or states, or no, there were other things that were more important. How did they make books, for instance, or how were the forms of sociability that were developed during the Enlightenment? No more classes, no more bourgeoisie, aristocracy. Okay.
Thank you. We have two questions. One, it's already there, and the other one I think will come after. From Cornel Ban, what strand of the Enlightenment is most useful to think critically about the climate crisis? And Natalia is threatening a question.
I'm not sure we do have something useful for the climate crisis, for understanding climate crisis. I think it would be very non-materialistic to say that we might use something from the Enlightenment to understand something that is very specific to our age. Of course, we can have a great narrative about the Anthropocene, etc. But I wouldn't, for pragmatic reasons, because I care in very different ways for Enlightenment and the climate crisis. The one is something that I like, and the other is something that I think we should solve. Okay, so the one is an intellectual interest, intellectual pleasure and passion, and the other I think is a very practical urgency. And I think we should rather focus, instead of seeing and extrapolating from old theories and trying to make a very sophisticated hermeneutics to make a détournement of these Enlightenment theories. I think we should rather focus on the practical problems of the climate crisis. I mean, we have tornadoes and rats around us. I think we should deal with this first. Okay, thank you. Maybe Natalia.
Natalia, if you want to ask the question, if you're not
Yes.
ready, then I'll let Simone. Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Veronica. This was really interesting. I have not a threatening, but a very big question, I guess, which probably would require a whole lecture of its own. But I think, so given that you started with this, I mean, with the prevalence of certain contemporary totalizing readings of the Enlightenment, right? I was wondering, when we look at these contemporary totalizing readings, would you say that when we look at their own origins, are we to find the explanation for this type of, and the prevalence of these totalizing readings rather in contemporary conditions of knowledge production, let's say, or are there longer term historical movements, right, which are very important for the selection of, and that favor these kind of readings?
I think I should know more about the conditions of knowledge production of post-colonial theory to answer this question properly. But my intuition is that they are both involved here. So I think there are longer legacies of criticism. But I also, so this longer take, which is an intellectual take, the transmission of criticism of concepts, etc. And the proof is that, as I said, many of these criticism, post-colonial and decolonial, tend to focus on German metaphysics. Okay, this is very interesting. This is very relevant, I think. Not necessarily on what, not necessarily on a very careful historical reading of the Enlightenment conditions of production of knowledge. Okay, so they are not always as materialist in this sense. Their materialism sometimes tends to be, let's talk about economic interests and empires, but not to see how exactly these knowledges were produced. But yeah, I think they might be also what you say, if I understand well what you asked, some particular conditions of knowledge production in the, I don't know, American academia in certain decades, but I wouldn't like to speculate about this because I don't know much about it. But I'm sure that as in many other things, this has a role to play. I should stop here and not comment upon anymore.
Thank you, Veronica. Simona, please.
Simona, we cannot hear you because your microphone is off.
I would like to thank you for the presentation. It was a very complex mapping of an entire plethora of authors, Enlightenment authors. I would like also to switch to Romanian and apologize to non-Romanian speakers still present, because it's easier, it's Friday evening and, well, așa. Am o întrebare și oarecum o provocare și iar tu, dacă dorești să răspunzi în română sau în engleză, e ok pentru mine. Prima întrebare e, m-am gândit care sunt mizele prezentării. Tu ești o foarte bună cunoscătoare, din ceea ce știu eu, a producției intelectuale și artistice din România și mă gândeam și a ceea ce se predă în universități și mă gândeam care sunt mizele vis-a-vis de cum este predată istoria filozofiei sau istoria antropologiei, pentru că ai citat din mai mulți autori din antropologie și l-aș menționa pe Talal Asad. Adică dacă sunt mizele prezentării, orice prezentare are și niște mize și când e vorba de cunoaștere e și politică, nu? Așa, deci asta e prima întrebare și oarecum o provocare. e un concept foarte interesant și anume, adică tu spui, ok, poate nu rămânem la teorii, ci abordarea care ne-ar fi interesantă și provocatoare e aceea de a ne uita la acele dislocări epistemice. Cum am putea să aducem aceste dislocări epistemice în a înțelege mai bine poate contextul și viața prezentă? Și știu că tu adesea intervii pe teme foarte actuale și mi-ar plăcea foarte mult să poate să te gândești la asta și să ne spui. Deci o întrebare și o provocare oarecum.
În ce sens să intervii? În ce sens să intervii?
De exemplu, de ce această abordare pe care o propui tu asupra înțelegerii iluminismului n-ar putea fi, să spunem, folositoare politic în cum gândim ce se întâmplă la momentul actual, în societatea românească. Ok, majoritatea dintre noi cred că suntem aici și cred că, adică citim și ca să putem să înțelegem oarecum altfel ce se întâmplă cu noi și cu societatea în care trăim, cel puțin mie așa merg, așa să cred. Da.
De ce să luăm luminile, Simona?
Da, exact, ceva de genul ăsta. Îmi pare rău că n-am putut să fiu atât de expresivă cu întrebarea, dar da. Și îți mulțumesc încă o dată pentru prezentare și mă bucur că ai fost parte din...
Mersi foarte mult, Simona. Cred că una din chestiile pe care, nu știu, care ar putea să fie de importanță pentru, nu știu, pentru un public intelectual mai larg, e chestiunea asta cu plasticitatea ideilor și cu faptul că există un destin social și contingent al unor chestii pe care unor le facem în anumite contexte și ele ajung să performeze în alte contexte, să însemne alte lucruri, să fie adoptate nu știu, de niște grupuri sociale foarte, foarte diferite și că nu controlăm chestiile astea. Și așa, la un nivel istoric, cred că există pur și simplu niște rupturi de sens de multe ori între noi și secolul XVIII, de unde există o aparentă continuitate între foarte multe. Practic, faptul că multe dintre ele sunt, de fapt, atât de mult niște intervenții contextuale, le face să fie mult mai puțin transparente pentru noi. Pe de altă parte, e clar că anumite chestii au supraviețuit tocmai pentru că nu sunt doar contextuale. Și că sunt în continuare nu doar niște, nu știu, niște lemne seci pe care le predăm la școală. Mă rog, în România nici nu se prea predă epoca asta, dar pot să fie în continuare niște instrumente, poate în primul rând, felul în care s-a reflectat asupra societății, denaturalizând societatea, inventând societatea, descoperind că există o societate, descoperind că există economie și niște relații de proprietate și relații de producție care nu sunt date de la bunul Dumnezeu, ci sunt niște forme care se adaptează istoric ca niște necesități și care produc mai departe forme culturale, inclusiv emoții, inclusiv forme de, nu știu, aranjamente domestice și așa mai departe. Deci există niște principii generale a chestiilor care cred că ar putea fi utile și există niște chestii particulare din care cred că ar putea să aibă niște mize pentru niște oameni interesați, fie și marginal de chestiunile astea. Mersi.
Thank you, mersi. Acum o să un pic. Bogdan, you said you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I like the, I was able to follow maybe like 30 minutes, 40 minutes from what you said. But I was thinking, so going back to the Enlightenment, as you know, as we know, when it comes to historical socialism, basically, you go back to reading the literature from 18th century, right, or 19th century. And to do that, basically, you go back and read it in a sort of a dialectical way, right? So that's the way how you can rethink the Enlightenment, or how you can see why the Enlightenment would be, important for us, for a progressive direction, right, of history, let's say. So I wonder how your approach would be different from this sort of a dialectics. Like, is it something else that you're doing? Do you, like, I don't know, do you go back to this sort of radical Enlightenment and you want to discover what's important with these thinkers, but outside of a sort of a dialectics? So what's the method here?
What I think would be the method for a political reading of it, I think it's not necessarily or not automatically to go to authors that are labeled as radical in a way or another, because sometimes they were labeled as radical for mistaken reasons, or they were radical in specific ways and not radical in another. And I think we can find very emancipatory political instruments and epistemic instruments in theories that were not necessarily very radical, or not in theories, in ways of describing things, in ways of writing history of the family, for instance, in authors that were not necessarily the most important ones, although the most important ones, the canonical authors, are sometimes actually the most interesting. That's not a total accident of history that they were preserved as a canon, but still there are minor authors who might offer great instruments for writing history, because they wrote a very interesting history. They rewrote history. They rewrote ancient Roman history, for instance. And I think I wouldn't look for external signs of radicalism, because sometimes these signs are just perimated. And what meant radical for an 18th century author doesn't mean that's radical for me now. And sometimes it's disappointing what radical meant for them. I mean, if you look at the abolitionist theories, which were of course very important, but they were gradualist. They took all kinds of precautions not to upset too much people, and the established structures, etc. So they were considered to be very disappointed by criticism of the Enlightenment. So maybe it's not, but in the same time, in their times, these were very radical. So I would look to non-explicit radicalism, let's say. I would invest with radicalism, things that were sometimes can be more modest.
Thank you, Veronica. If there are other questions, this would be the moment to ask them. Okay, if there aren't, then I would propose to end our evening here. Thanking you again, Veronica Lazăr, for this presentation, and for answering the questions, and for the most engaging lecture. Thank you again for participating, for preparing this lecture for us, and thank you again to the public for having the patience to stay until the end, and for participating in the events organized in this project by tranzit.ro Cluj. Thank you all, and have a great Friday evening. Goodbye, and thank you
very much as well.